Welcome to the panel session on governing in the time of COVID and our climate emergency, based on the book, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, Governance in a Climate Emergency by Ray Ison and Ed Straw, with contributions by the following authors as indicated here, with the affiliations indicated as well. The panel design is a conversation based on different relationships panelists have with our book. We have this pre-prepared video which outlines the panel design, introduces the four panelists and overviews the main themes of Ison and Straw. The first 30 minutes will be taken up by contributions from panel members. We then have a breakout followed by plenary questions. In this design, the book is a mediating object to allow panelists to talk about how they are using or responding to the book and the issues it raises for them relevant to an ASC audience. This image shows the panelists, Huda Khayyam, a doctoral student at the Open University, Fred Steer, a reviewer of the book from Florida in the US, Ed Straw, co-author of the book, and Ray Ison, also a co-author of the book. The talk in this short video will cover who are we that seek to govern, what do we do when we govern? What do we need to govern? And we will introduce very briefly some of the emergent themes that are arising for the panelists and set the scene for them to talk about them. I have an organizing metaphor for this particular video clip. The metaphor is what I call the tango of responsibility. Tango is a particular dance which requires great choreography and is about relationship. And the tango of responsibility we are speaking about in this talk today is that of our relationship and responsibility to each other, to other species, and to the biosphere which we inhabit. I speak out of a time of great angst around the globe with the global COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, this is not the first pandemic that humans have confronted, but the pandemic has highlighted very significant and widespread failures in our governance systems. It's found many of our historical institutions wanting, and it's hard to know exactly what is going to happen next. A recession is already present in certain countries, and beyond that we have the spectre of climate change. Climate change is different, however, in that it is new to human history. So I want to start with this setting which highlights so many limitations and failings in our contemporary governance systems. Why do we have so many failings in our governance systems? Well, a contention of our book is that we have institutionalized thinking about what it is to be humans, and this has corrupted our governance systems. Some of these particular understandings of what it is to be human are captured in the phrase from economics of Homo economicus. As Jonathan Aldred points out in his very good book, License to be Bad, How Economics Corrupted Us, at the heart of this conception is the assumption that ideal choice, that the perfectly rational human exists. But according to Aldred, much of economic theory is conceptually, ethically, and practically flawed. So if you align the limitations of Homo economicus with those limitations that come to us from misinterpretations of Darwinian evolutionary theory, ideas of competition, and very narrow conceptions about human greed and behavior, then we have at the heart of our contemporary concerns a failure to understand really what it is to be human. Now, we come from a tradition of cyber systemics, particularly second order cybernetic understandings, as manifest in the many conversations of the American Society of Cybernetics. And I want to start to unpack what we as a community and as a contributor to particular discourses have to offer, and what we can help to recover in moving forward. So if we address the question, what do we do when we do what we do, then an answer always must start from us as embodied, situated human beings. All practice doing is situated and embodied. And it follows that all observations require an observer, everything is said by someone, we live in language, all knowing is doing, all being, knowing and doing is relational, and all observers, practitioners, actors have a history, a tradition of understanding out of which we think and act. Think of the young mammal, both a product of evolution and a particular pattern of behavior. Relationships is, I would contend, fundamental to what it is to be human. And these images manifest and make clear just how a young human enters the world and becomes a doing being in the world. If we break down these relational dynamics, then our world comes undone. Relationship occurs in different ways. Touch is essential for many aspects of becoming human and maintaining our humanness. Mating behaviour, child rearing, cognitive development, and no doubt many people are suffering from the lack of touch in their lives today as we isolate in lockdown. And no doubt that will have consequences. But on the other hand, heightened connectivity that our world has delivered favours the transmission of the virus. So we have a struggle going on about what it is to be human and how to maintain our safety in this particular time. Now, science is showing up new insights into our humanness. This is one particular story that I think has opportunities to help us recover what I call human systemic sensibilities, based on the argument that we humans are born into relationship and that this is constitutive of a systemic sensibility which we either retain or dilute or lose because of the way the world has become structured. Now, some of you may be familiar with the work on microbiomes, the ecology of organisms we mainly carry in our guts. And these, I think, have the potential to help us abandon commitments to Homo economicus and to recover the idea of humans as relational beings, recognizing that who we are is a product of our dependence on our interdependencies with other organisms and other elements of the biosphere. Human cells make up only 43% of the body's total cell count, so we are essentially a walking ecology. Other strands of cyber-systemic scholarship offer other opportunities, and we should work to recover these in our discourse and actions. The work of Umberto Maturana and Pele Bunel talks about the trajectories that Homo sapiens may pursue, whether it's Homo sapiens aggressans, Homo sapiens amans. Are we going to be evolve as a species immersed in aggression or a species immersed in love? This comes from the work on the biology of love, understood as others arising as legitimate others. The work of Klaus Krippendorf on authentic conversation, his work on major metaphors of communication, and the recognition that the only really relevant biological metaphor that explains how communication operates is the dance ritual metaphor. Appreciations that cognition is a relational, embodied, and historically structure-determined process rather than an input or transfer of information. And the traditions of understanding out of which we think and act are always with us and govern how we engage with the world. There are understandings of what it means to be social coming from Maturana, the arguments that compassion must replace capitalism, or of seeing the economy as only one way of being social. So what do we do when we govern? Well, I just want to briefly cover 4 metaphors for governing that we address in our book, and these all draw on cybersystemic thinking. The first one is the sailing steering metaphor, reformulating the cybernetic feedback metaphor for governing. The second is the praxis of governing as orchestrated social learning. The third is governing as guided improvisation and emergence. And the fourth is governing as trajectory correcting co-evolution in the structural coupling of humans to the biosphere. This image depicts the first metaphor, that of the sailing or steersman, the origin of the word cybernetics. And the important aspect of this particular metaphor is that it is a way of understanding the relational dynamics that have to operate for sailing as an effective performance to function in the feedback processes between humans, technology, and the biosphere, whether it's feedback from currents, wind, the tiller, the design of the boat, the social purpose of what the race or direction or travel is all about. So it is a fundamentally cybernetic and systemic dynamic that needs to be appreciated as part of governing. The second metaphor, that of the praxis of governing as orchestrated social learning, can be understood through this image, and the idea that a performance is orchestrated by a group of individuals with different histories, backgrounds, technologies, scores, roles, who come together, work hard together, and create a satisfying performance or not for an audience over time. And so one can understand this metaphor as both a dynamic, a social relational dynamic, as well as an entity. The orchestra exists and you can invest in it if you wish. It's built on the appreciation that much of our governance arrangements and institutions are built on an idea of a fixed form of knowledge which is applied to a problem and which remains relevant over a period of time. And from this you can attempt to normalize practice, regulate markets, raise awareness. But this is a really dubious conception in an unfolding world where stationarity is dead and the world is full of surprise. Instead, we have to reframe knowing as occurring within the act of constructing the issue through social learning and promoting concerted action in context, orchestrated, performance-specific ways. The third metaphor, governing as guided improvisation, can be a way of highlighting Ashby's law of requisite variety, in that governing performances need to be contextualized and have the variety to deal with the variety that is necessary in localized ways. And in a way, some of the emerging response to COVID exemplifies this by attempting to get governance as a response to hotspots as opposed to bounded whole nation states or sub-states. The fourth metaphor, governing as trajectory correcting co-evolution, can be understood by the simple practice of walking. Walking arises in the relational dynamics between a social system, a bodied and embodied human being, and a medium such as the floor or the biosphere. And we humans, if we wish to persist into the future in a viable form or shape, need to understand and be capable of moving our trajectory, our unfolding trajectories of structural coupling with the biosphere to maintain our viability and a quality of existence that means we can flourish. The biosphere will go on without us, so the crux of governing in this particular metaphor is the relational dynamic between us and the biosphere. Thirdly, what do we need to govern? Well, to go back and remind us, climate change as the big one which is now present with us, the Anthropocene, is new to human history, and thus the institutions and our particular processes are up for reconsideration. Are they capable of doing what we have to have done? The evidence in the pandemic is that many of them are not capable, although some governance systems have operated more effectively than others. So the arguments in our book is that on the left-hand side here, this heuristic provides a way of speaking about governance in systemic, cyber-systemic terms. Governance can be seen as a relational dynamic between the state, the judiciary, the private sector and civil society, with the media floating around between civil society and the private sector, depending on where it sits. Or in some states, it's a product of the state. So this is a high-level simplification of a very complex set of dynamics, but we need to be able to talk about governance as if it were a system and how the various subsystems hang together or don't hang together and what the component parts are. So this heuristic, as we unpack it in the book, enables you to talk about the efficacy of governance in China and the US at the same time by talking about its particular sets of arrangements, its constituent parts and its institutional arrangements. We, in particular, point out that there are emergent failures of our governance systems, particularly what is called state capture in some countries, or preferential lobbying, and that is the capture of our governance processes by vested interests and the manipulation of governance to towards those interests. It's very apparent, in my view, in most nation states. The argument of the book is that we need to transform or transcend our contemporary governance arrangements and to introduce three new elements into our governance system, starting with the biosphere as central, recognizing the place and role of technology, and the technosphere, that great mass of stuff that we humans have laid down on the surface of the earth in a few short centuries, and the third one, the whole question of social purpose, which for us fails to be able to be addressed by current arrangements of the state. We can say more about that in the panel discussion. This is an interesting slide from The Economist, which a few months ago made the arguments that democracies contain epidemics more effectively. But I would say that's up for grabs. But our heuristic enables interpretation and exploration of questions like this. How do our governance system enable certain manners of living together to become manifest? It enables exploration of institutions that may no longer be fit for purpose. For example, in Minneapolis, the city council is reconsidering the whole role of police forces and the way in which those have been historically constituted in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. So the challenge, of course, is how you move from our current state towards some future state, and our book addresses that in considerable detail. Essential to it is adding new elements, producing new systemic relations, inhabiting those new relations with new practices, and particularly inhabiting them with new institutions, understood as new rules of the game which we humans invent, and a shift towards what we call systemic governance. Just to explicate those three new terms for you, the biosphere is the sum of all ecosystems. The technosphere is all those structures humans have constructed on the planet: houses, factories, farms, mines, roads, cement, etc. And social purpose is that pursuit of purpose, articulation and articulation of purpose to achieve social ends in deliberative forms of systemic inquiry and social learning. The book contains, amongst other things, 26 principles for systemic governing, organised as 4 sets. 6 relating to the biosphere and people, 8 relating to democracy and subsidiarity, 7 relating to governments, and 5 relating to companies. So that brings us to relating to the book, the topic of the panel. The panelists are going to talk about emergent cybersystemic themes which arise from their experiences of engaging with the book. Huda Kayam, who's engaged in doctoral study at the Open University, will talk about how the book has influenced the design and conduct of her doctoral studies to date. Fred Steyer, who very kindly reviewed the book pre-publication for the publishers Routledge, is going to talk about aspects of the book that he's been using in his teaching, and he's going to relate it to one particular case study of his own. Ed Straw will talk about some emergent issues that still are high on his agenda. These include how to overcome preferential lobbying, which is still widespread, and the idea that we might invent some powerful new metaphors to help us shift our governance systems in the directions we argue for. And I will talk briefly about the enactment of systemic design processes and how we can see governance transformation as a product of cyber-systemic thinking brought to novel designs. This final slide makes an offer of a discount should you wish to buy the book, and it provides selected links to including a book launch if you want to have some further background either pre our panel session or post our panel session. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the panel session.